We're very grateful to the Lutheran members and congregants who are always working to support CLWR and the work that we do, both with refugees in Canada and working with displaced persons and refugees out in the world who are victims of violence and conflict. So refugee work continues to be important, and your continued support is still very much appreciated.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here with us today. My name is Hannah, and I'm part of the Young Canadian Lutheran community. I'm also a member of the Circle for Reconciliation and Justice Committee for the Eastern Synod and a trained volunteer for the Racial Justice Advisory Committee's Community Conversations Initiative. So as this webinar is hosted by Remembering Today for the Church of Tomorrow, representing the ELCIC from coast to coast to coast. We would like to begin by acknowledging the colonial history of our country. In particular, we would like to acknowledge the land we benefit from that has been claimed predominantly by white Christian settler people, and whose abundance has been withheld from our Indigenous neighbors all across what we refer to as Canada. I invite you, should you know, to share the traditional territory that you're residing on in the group chat below. If you're unfamiliar, I've just sent a link to that same chat to a website where you can later input your postal code to learn more about the territories, treaties, and languages that are linked to the original peoples native to the land that you are of. For myself, I will begin by acknowledging that I am currently tuning in and residing on the Haldimand Tract, 6 miles on either side of the Grand River that was promised to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations people. So we'll just give it a second here longer if anyone else is finishing typing where they're from into the chat. Some fellow Haldimand Tract folks. Treaty 7, Treaty 4, and 2. Yeah, Cressida's currently on Six Nations territory. Great, excellent. All right, wonderful. Feel free to finish that up if you're still in the middle of typing, no pressure. Thank you all for your contributions in the chat. And before we proceed, I invite you to join me in a prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this safe and plentiful place we call home, and for all the peoples who have helped to make it so. Help us to come together to reconcile the wrongs that have been committed on this land in your name. Be with those who died and the family of those who died and continue to suffer as a result of the trauma that was inflicted through residential schools, the 60s scoop, foreign illnesses, war, and continued neglect and disenfranchisement from governing powers. May we work toward true community and prosperity and set aside the comforts of the self-centered greed that we have grown accustomed to by way of the privileges we inherited from colonial policies. Help strengthen us, God, to care for our neighbors and to share the wealth and abundance that you have blessed us with. Amen. Amen. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the Lutheran Immigration Board today.
Thank you, Hannah, for orientating us to the land, and reminded me of the Psalms, which really catch the spirit of what we're doing, I think. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, and the world in which we dwell. We're all children of the land together, and that's beautiful. Thank you for doing that. I am Don Sjoberg, the 92-year-old on this wonderful group of people I've come to know Hanne Kuhnert and Gordon Jensen and Steve Larson, and for Becky is in correspondence with us. And it's been a great experience. For 2 years now, we've been working with help from other people as well, gathering these stories. And this is the third of our webinars, co-hosted with Lutheran Theological Seminary in Saskatoon and Martin Luther University College, Waterloo, Kitchener. And this one, it really interests me, this webinar, as it ties together this the work of what we want to do in our global responsibilities. And I think it's great that Marcus Busch is done the research and the writing for this. Karen, I talked to you after your visit with the Alberta Synod, Albertan Territories Synod, and at that time, I was describing all the connections we have with Canadian Lutheran World Relief over many years. And at the time I mentioned that Marcus Busch's father had met many of the immigrants from Europe at Lethbridge. And afterwards at the convention, this gentleman came up to me and said, I was one of those persons. So we are marvelously connected in the work and in the stories that continue to be told. So it's wonderful to look forward to that presentation. And I'm glad that, Karen, glad that you are here along with two of your staff members. And we look forward to your words at the conclusion of our, near the conclusion of our webinar. But to get the show on the road, so to speak, I call upon Gordon Jensen, who will be leading us through the webinar, and for him to introduce our presenter.
Well, thank you. I'm Gordon Jensen, Emeritus William Hordern Professor of Theology at the Lutheran Seminary in Saskatoon. And it is my delight today to welcome our speaker, Marcus Busch, who will be speaking on the Lutheran Immigration Board, a forerunner of CLWR. He's no stranger to this topic. For example, he was exposed to post-war immigration as a pastor's son in Lethbridge in the early 1950s. Marcus and his spouse, Margaret Sadler, have also served as volunteers with the Lutheran World Federation's Department of World Service in 2000, 2001, and again in 2007 and 8. He's a past director and president of Canadian Lutheran World Relief. He's also the author of 2 books, the last one being Parsonage People, the family story of Rudy and Emma Busch, and they live in Edmonton. As a history buff, Marcus graciously accepted the request to give a presentation on the Lutheran Immigration Board. So welcome, Marcus. We look forward to hearing from you, and please welcome him as well. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for those kind words, Gordon. And I'm just going to get my screen adjusted here for a moment. So as part of the Remembering Today for the Church of Tomorrow project's webinar series of the Canadian Lutheran History Project, I was invited to tell the story of Canadian Lutheran World Relief. It's a big story. And after undertaking a literature review of that subject, I found that the story has already been skillfully told by several authors over a period of decades, not to say there isn't more to say. There was, however, a smaller, thinly documented, barely a story at all, that was equally fascinating and serving as a finger, pointing to the incorporation and work of its successor, CLWR. I'm referring to the Lutheran Immigration Board of Canada, known throughout this webinar as LIB. Founded in 1923 and on the books until 1943, a scant 3 years before CLWR's incorporation. So it is right and salutary that on the 100th anniversary of its founding, the Lutheran Immigration Board be led out of the shadows and its story shared with all those who value his story as told through the life and work of this dynamic Canadian Lutheran agency. So we begin with looking at the push from Europe of European immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which involved several factors, including population pressures, land economics, displacement by war and revolution, political repression, and other human rights issues. Land in Europe was becoming increasingly scarce as agricultural holdings became smaller, as population increased and the land was subdivided for succession purposes. The Pan-Slav movement of the late 19th and early 20th century stoked anti-German sentiment in Eastern Europe. The 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia replaced the Romanov dynasty with a social experiment that quickly careened out of control. The conclusion of the First World War on the Eastern and Southern fronts cast off the vestiges of the near-feudal monarchies of the Russian and Ottoman empires and led to the redrawing of national boundaries affecting many ethnic Germans via the treaties that ended the First World War. Going back, tens of thousands of German-speaking citizens settled in Russia for 150 years on the invitation of Tsarina Catherine the Great were now persona non grata in Russia, and that includes my forebears. Similarly, the Donauschwaben, that is Germans who had settled in the eastern provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire north of the Danube, in areas known as Bukovina, Galicia, Volhynia, were also seen as interlopers. And again, I had a grandparent included in this group. These earlier immigrants from the German states and principalities were viewed in Germany and then later in Canada as less desirable, as accounted for by the distinction between the terms Reichsdeutsch and Volksdeutsch. Germans from within Germany were known as Reichsdeutsch. Those living outside the boundaries of Germany were known as Volksdeutsch or Auslanddeutsch. Meanwhile, Germany, after the significant military losses of the First World War, was suffering from a shortage of agricultural workers, compelling it to turn to Eastern Europe for manpower. At the same time, in 1924, the German government enacted a decree prohibiting the dissemination of information on immigration to work abroad. German immigration policy discouraged immigration to Canada specifically, citing low wages, rough living conditions, and poor treatment of immigrants in our Canada. Well, that's the push of immigration. And then there's the pull of Canadian immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the pull to Canada involved the opposite: population density, land economics, and political and human right considerations. Canada, then as now the second largest country in the world, had a small population, 9.5 million in 1926. Canada needed to increase its population to grow as a nation. And there was land, lots of land to be settled and unfortunately exploited. Even so, Canadian immigration policy forbade citizens of Germany, with which Canada had been at war, from entering the Dominion for 5 years post-war until January 1923. And of course, upon closer examination, Canada's system of immigration in the early 1900s favored Anglo-Saxons and whites and was clearly racist. And it was, tragically, as we heard in the land acknowledgement, a land settlement system that was genocidal towards its indigenous population. At least 3 German Lutheran agencies relating to immigration from Europe acted in partnership with LIB. The Society for Home Mission in Schleswig-Holstein, that's north central Germany, the Evangelical Lutheran Immigration Mission in Hamburg, also northern Germany, and the German Foreign Institute in Stuttgart, southwestern Germany. A German wanting to immigrate under the auspices of the LIB required a letter of recommendation from the pastor of a local Lutheran congregation. This letter was to include a religious attestation as well as an identity card. Meanwhile, in Canada, Professor Henry Harms, an early director of the LIB, is quoted as saying, "Thousands in Europe had lost everything because of the war and the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution. They were looking for an opportunity to start life anew. Many of these people had relatives in this country, that is Canada, but, and I emphasize this, an agency was lacking to make it possible for them to come across. We, that is LIB, set out to be this agency." LIB was not a church organization per se, although its clergy members represented the 3 German Lutheran bodies operating in Western Canada. Its membership included the 3 church presidents and pastors interested in the growth of congregations. LIB served as an informal arm then of home missions. As an autonomous Canadian organization, LIB had the flexibility to operate as a homegrown Canadian organization. This helped it relate effectively with agencies of the Canadian government and with Canadian transportation companies. The Lutheran Immigration Board was founded in Winnipeg on 26 April 1923 with the following 3 purposes: to bring German settlers to Canada, to promote the interests of the Lutheran Church in Canada, and to relieve the sufferings of Germans in Europe. There was an unwritten 4th goal, and that was to promote the continuity of the German language and culture in Canada. LIB's affiliation with the CPR was particularly helpful in the German immigration process. Traugott Otto Francis Herzer, a Wisconsin-born ordained minister of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, after resigning from the ministry in Alberta, was appointed manager of the CPR's Department of Immigration and Colonization. And in this role, Herzer traveled to Europe to help with the movement of German Lutherans and other Europeans to Canada. He attended to LIB and other organizations' interests in Germany. He corresponded with the Canadian government on behalf of the LIB and others, and was a member of LIB delegations that visited Ottawa. The head office of LIB was at 439 Main Street, Winnipeg. LIB's Western branch, working from this office, covered the Prairie provinces. The Eastern branch, covering the territory from Fort William, now Thunder Bay, to the Atlantic coast, had its main office in Toronto. Legally, the Western and Eastern branches were constituted as separate entities with different names, different directors, and different articles and dates of incorporation. The Western branch was incorporated under the Federal Companies Act in December 1926. It had 15 directors. The Eastern branch was incorporated under the same name in November 1929 with 7 directors. The directors were all German Lutheran clergymen. The branches were bound by a common executive committee, which oversaw LIB's global work. The focus of LIB's work was primarily in Western Canada, where it employed a full-time executive secretary in Winnipeg. The Eastern branch had its own volunteer executive secretary, and the LIB had a representative in Ottawa, Reverend L. Ebinger. LIB operated at the same time as other immigration organizations, both church-affiliated and secular, all with the same basic purposes. Within Canada, and also promoting German schools, language, and culture, were the Association of German Catholics, going by the acronym VDCK. It's interesting to note that most German-speaking immigrants to Canada were Protestant, although 25% were Roman Catholic. the Canadian Mennonite Board of Colonization, founded in 1922, and bookmarking LIB was the German Baptist Immigration and Colonization Society, founded in 1925. Other religio-ethnic immigration organizations active in the 1920s included those with Dutch, Polish, Norwegian, Danish, Scottish, Hungarian, and Swedish origins. In the United States and Canada of the 1920s, several Lutheran churches had been constituted, each representing the ethnic origin of their founders. All were headquartered in the United States. 3 German-speaking Lutheran churches involved in the formation and work of the LIB were the Evangelical Lutheran Joint Synod of Ohio and other states, thankfully known as Ohio Synod, founded in 1818. They had a Canada district which was formed in 1908. And although they don't have a logo, this is a picture of the commemorative plaque in Somerset, Ohio, marking the location of their first regular session. Then there was the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, founded in 1847. Its Canada district was formed in 1879. And third, the United Lutheran Church in America, known as the ULCA. LIB's governing board comprised 3 church-appointed members, 1 from each of the 3 supporting synods, plus a member from each province. An executive committee of 7 directors directed the work of the board. Pastor Edward Schmoke, who's represented here again by a plaque of the Ohio Synod, was serving a parish in Neudorf, Saskatchewan, when he became an LIB director in June 1924. He was elected vice president of the executive committee at the 1926 annual meeting in Saskatoon. And in the same year, Pastor Schmoke was also elected manager of the Western Branch, a role which he held for 17 years, from 1926 to 1943. And the engraving on Schmoke's gravestone says, "I am prepared." The LIB worked transatlantically with staff, consultants, and allies. And in various times and places, it acted as a researcher and promoter of settlement possibilities, an immigration consultancy, an advocacy organization working with the government agencies of Germany and Canada, a travel agency, a dockside migrant reception and inland settlement service, a church building facilitator for German-speaking Lutheran congregations in Canada, and a supporter of the German language and culture in Canada amongst new immigrants. Let's get into the weeds and see how LIB's immigration process worked. LIB directors determined which rural Lutheran parishes would be willing and able to receive and care for immigrants, and in what numbers. A local committee of farmers, chaired by the local pastor, was formed. Contracts between local farmer employers and the local committee were concluded and forwarded to LIB's eastern or western branches as appropriate. When the LIB's executive secretary had 25 or more contracts in hand, he cabled LIB's European representative to select the required number of immigrants to match with the available contracts. When the immigrants arrived at a Canadian port, they were met by an LIB representative who held the signed contracts. He assigned the new arrivals to various farmer employers, had the new arrivals sign their contracts, and helped arrange their rail travel. With their contracts in hand, the new arrivals were dispatched to the matched local committee for placement. The immigrants remained under the jurisdiction of this local committee for 1 year, or until the travel debt to LIB was repaid. Contracting farmers were required to provide employment that included salary, lodging, meals, and local transportation. Annual salaries in the 1920s were about $300. Half of the first year's earnings went to pay for transportation to Canada, while the other half was retained by the immigrant. During the First World War, German immigrants who had not become naturalized Canadian citizens were labeled enemy aliens and were subject to internment. In 1919, immigration was barred to nationals of those countries with which Canada had been at war. Germany, therefore, lost favored nation status until a policy change in April 1923. And wasting no time, the founders of LIB acted within that same month to establish their agency. Nevertheless, immigrants from post-war Germany, as well as those from Eastern Europe, were classified as non-preferred immigrants, and only AgLabs, short for agricultural laborers, and domestics were initially admitted. The Canadian government viewed the work of the LIB and the other religious immigration boards in a very positive light, as these agencies ended many of the dishonest practices and abuses of the system perpetrated by other agents. The 4 Canadian church-affiliated immigration societies mentioned above, Catholic, Mennonite, Baptist, and Lutheran, cooperated with both the CPR and the CNR to bring German immigrants to Canada. Both railways had their own departments for the settlement of immigrants. The CPR had its Department of Immigration and Colonization. The CNR had its Department of Colonization. In 1919, the Canadian government established the nonprofit Canadian Colonization Association, known as the CCA. This association recruited settlers in Europe, assigned them to a district in Canada, and assisted them in finding employment. In this way, the Canadian government organized the immigration and settlement of agriculturists using the railways, which had large land holdings that they were eager to settle. The CCA was affiliated with 25 immigration boards, 19 of which were headquartered in the 3 prairie provinces. In September 1925, the Liberal government of Prime Minister Mackenzie King formalized an agreement with the CPR to take over the sole responsibility of the CCA, giving it the authority to control the recruitment and settlement of European agriculturists. This railway agreement of 1925 allowed the CPR to issue occupational certificates to immigrants of the then non-preferred nations, shown on this map. The CPR was thus empowered to control who could come to Canada, in essence, a railway monopoly. The 1925 railway agreement was cancelled in 1930 by the new Conservative government of Prime Minister R.B. Bennett due to a lack of fit between the new restrictive government immigration policy and the settlement goals of the CPR. Ultimately, however, the cancellation was precipitated by the Great Depression with its rising high rate of national unemployment. Internecine struggles involving the 2 railways, the federal government, and LIB contributed to the formation in November 1928 of a rival Lutheran immigration agency for processing German immigrants. In January 1928, a conference had been held among the Land Settlement Committee of UCLA's Manitoba Synod, a representative of the North German Lloyd Steamship Company, and representatives of the CNR. Not surprisingly, most of the congregations of the Manitoba Synod were in communities served by the CNR. The new organization was christened the Canadian Lutheran Immigration Aid Society. The CNR ended up providing some financial support to ULCA immigrant missionaries. Now, unlike the LIB, CLIAS had no overseas operation. It worked exclusively with the CNR, helping with the settlement of Europeans of European immigrants in Canada after their arrival in the country, and the resettlement of recently arrived German Lutherans who felt the need to move within Canada. At first, ULCA pastors Thomas Hardig and Wilhelm Wall retained their LIB board member positions while also serving on the CLIAS board. In the interwar period, between 1919 and 1935, estimates suggest that 100,000 German-speaking immigrants arrived in Canada from Europe. Accurate statistics on the total sponsored by LIB are sadly not available. The figures compiled by the source authors as well show considerable variability. What is reported is that during the first 3 years of its operation, 1923 to 25 inclusive, the LIB brought about 2,200 immigrants to Canada, caring for them without any financial help from any order of government and managing a budget of $300,000. Here are partial LIB statistics for the first 5 years of operation. 1923, 300 plus. 1924, for the 6 months of January to June, 567. 1925, 1,300. 1926, no figures are available. In 1927, for the 9 months January to October, 924. Now, of these, 70%, or 647, were agriculturalists, 57%, 526, were from Germany, and 43%, 397, were from outside the boundaries of Germany. In 1927, the immigration status of German nationals, that's the Reichsdeutsch, was elevated to preferred, and this helps explain a bump in immigration numbers for this particular year. From 1923 to 1930, of a total influx to Canada of 25,000 German nationals, that's the Reichsdeutsch, the LIB helped with the immigration of 4,000, or 16%. Now, of all these numbers, here's the one that I think is the most important. And that is, including the Reichsdeutsch 4,000 I just mentioned, the LIB in total assisted 16,000 German Lutheran immigrants from Europe and other Eastern European countries. Now, of that 16,000, 10,573 settled in Western Canada, 5,427 settled in Eastern Canada. Half of the immigrants were men, with the remaining equally divided between women and children. 3/4 of the adults were between 20 and 40 years of age. After the crash of the North American stock markets in 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression and the dirty 30s on the Canadian prairies, Canadian immigration policy changed in August 1930 and again in March 1931, reducing the flow of immigrants to a trickle until 1946. To tell the whole story of German immigration to Canada, it is necessary to mention that then, as now, Canada served as a way station for many on their way to the United States. And there was also significant movement of German Americans into Canada in the early decades of the 20th century. The LIB was a creature of its time. It was not a church organization, yet its board members were all clergy, salaried by their respective church bodies. Church funds were not used in its support. This came from steamship commissions. Its Winnipeg office, along with that of other immigration boards, was provided by the CPR. And it being a social organism of its time, LIB was entirely male-led and entirely clergy-led. Sometimes LIB provided funds to the mission boards of the churches, leading to criticism that church and business were mixing. Nevertheless, cooperation within the LIB was born of a common need of the churches to spend domestic mission dollars wisely. The Great Depression marked the end of the interwar wave of German-speaking immigration to Canada. Schmoke and the LIB continued to meet. However, with its raison d'etre, and in German, its Existenzberechtigung, having largely evaporated, the LIB lost members and vitality. The LIB officially stopped operations in 1943. The Reverend Dr. Norman J. Threinen, a Missouri Synod historian, suggests another reason for the decline and demise of the LIB, its lack of transparency. The organization lacked a visual identity. Its minutes, government documents, statistics, and related archival materials are sparse. Threinen says there was an aura of secrecy that surrounded its meetings. Although LIB existed until 1943, a scant 3 years before the formation of its successor, Canadian Lutheran World Relief, in 1946, LIB was not perceived as the organization to carry on the work of the post-Second World War settlement of European refugees in Canada, perhaps because of its inactivity of its later years. A new organization was needed to represent all Lutheran churches in Canada. A new organization working internationally with the soon-to-be-formed Lutheran World Federation, founded in Lund, Sweden in 1947. A through line continued, however, in the person of T.O.F. Herzer, who had helped birth the LIB and assisted at the birth of the CLWR. This treatise tells the story of the remarkable accomplishments of a small, dedicated organization of Canadian German Lutheran clergy, the Lutheran Immigration Board of Canada. The work of the board shows the evolution and maturing of the Lutheran Church in Canada in several ways. Lutheran churches worked together when there were multiple Lutheran churches with various histories, models of governance, and relationships with other churches and each other. They worked together to create an autonomous Lutheran organization with a scope of mission extended into matters of international migration. Canadian Lutherans worked ecumenically, sharing staff resources and experiences to further their mission of helping with immigration from Europe, namely cooperating with T.O.F. Herzer and with the Roman Catholic, Mennonite, Baptist, and other immigration boards. Canadian Lutherans cultivated autonomy in Canadian church decision-making and action, while at the same time maintaining harmonious relationships with their American church head offices. Canadian Lutherans worked in partnership with multiple levels of the Canadian government, as well as working in partnership with large corporate interests such as the CPR, CNR, and transatlantic steamship companies. In these and other ways, the Lutheran Immigration Board was a successful forerunner and model for its successor, Canadian Lutheran World Relief. Thanks be to God for the blessing that was the Lutheran Immigration Board of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for your presentation on the Lutheran Immigration Board. As you noted, it was one of those forerunners of the Canadian Lutheran World Relief, founded in 1946. As with the Lutheran Immigration Board, the first role of CLWR also was the settlement of refugees in Canada, although CLWR dealt, of course, with refugees from the Second War, while the LIB dealt with refugees following the First War. And while refugee settlement following the destruction wrought by war was the primary focus, it was always not just the only task they faced, and you pointed that out. You also astutely noted that the push and pull connected to the European and primarily German immigrants refugees were both driven from the devastation of Europe and attracted to the promise of farmland, especially, and a country that promised a bountiful life. I think one of the interesting points that you raised that I like to mull over was the unwritten agenda item you mentioned of preserving the German language in Canada. I was thinking of that because it was only 150 years earlier that the fledgling United States of America narrowly voted to choose English as its language rather than German. I think the vote was only a couple votes different. How might a different outcome in that vote have changed the makeup of North American society? Marcus, you also perceptively noticed that the LIB was not a church organization. And I think we sometimes underestimate the impact of that. Even though they had many Lutheran clergy on their board, for example. And I think this presented both challenges and opportunities, requiring those affiliated with various German Lutheran churches in Canada to quote scripture, as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves in dealing with the various players. And I think the other part of it, which you also mentioned, was at the same time, Canadian Lutherans were trying to work out their relationship with the US Lutherans and that sense of autonomy. And this just further complicated it. But I also found it striking and even jarring to be reminded that one of the major agendas of LIB was blatantly stated as colonization. Bringing refugees to Canada to create a better life for them meant that such actions also created refugees within Canada, namely among the Indigenous peoples. Nowhere was this more blatantly stated, perhaps, than in the name of Canada's Department of Immigration and Colonization and the railway company's Departments of Colonization, which were tasked with facilitating colonization in Western Canada. I noted in your presentation, one of the posters, the subtitle was "Keep Canada British." Very interesting. Our current sensitivity to the problems related to and created by colonization is a reminder of how our perceptions of settlement have changed in the last 100 years. But it's also a reminder that in working towards truth and reconciliation today, it was not only residential schools that created injustices. Despite the good and noble intentions of the LIB, the consequent displacement of indigenous peoples on the land is something our churches and our society need to be cognizant of, and there is still much to be done. You also noted astutely that while cooperation among Lutherans, especially German-speaking Lutherans in Canada, was one of the benefits of engagement with the government agencies, there were also significant concerns that arose from the work of LIB. Theologically, this was called unionism. That is, working with other Lutherans who did not subscribe to the Lutheran confessional documents and the understanding of the inerrancy of Scripture in the same way as yourselves, was a challenge that the LIB was really never able to adequately address. I don't know if the Lutheran churches have still adequately addressed it. Were other Lutherans really Lutheran? They often wondered. Sad to say, the fears of unionism have prevented full engagement by all Lutherans in many areas of life among Canadian Lutheranism. The fear of losing one's Lutheran identity has led to many Lutherans withdrawing support for fellow Lutherans and fellow citizens, not just in Canada, but throughout the world. On the other hand, many Lutherans have also not always cooperated with others in an attempt to be relevant to society. So the struggles between identity and relevance are one of the realities of Lutheranism in Canada and elsewhere, and they were already seen as present in the Lutheran Immigration Board. Finally, I would like to highlight the fact that despite our failures and successes, the Lutheran Immigration Board and later CLWR have tried to uphold, I think, one of the most important tenets of Lutheran theology, namely the importance of caring for the neighbor. Luther's catechisms are saturated with the importance of seeking what is best for the neighbor, and it is calling that is still foundational for Lutheranism today. We're reminded, however, that care for the neighbor is something that is to be a part of our DNA as Christians in Canada today. But that requires us to constantly reevaluate who our neighbors in need are. That is the constant task before us. So thank you, Marcus, for this fine presentation. I'm sure many of you will have some comments and questions. And so after a 10-minute break, we will come back and we will open it up for questions and discussion. So we'll take a break now for 10 minutes. Thank you. Well, welcome back. We're glad to have you back again. And I want to thank the young Canadian Lutherans that have been helping out to facilitate and make this webinar a possibility. Hanne Kuhnert, Jennifer Arden, and Christina Kuhnert. And I really appreciate it. And check out their website and their information. And you can make a link, I believe, through the Canadian Lutheran webinars or webpage as well. Couple reminders again that you can post questions in the chat room, and we'll have Marcus address them as they can. I would begin with one question. Or first, thanks, Karen, for your comments in chat about the prime ministers at the time, and also the fact that the records for William Lyon Mackenzie King are at the Laurier Archives, as well as many other notable items that could be studied and explored to your heart's content. One of the questions Marcus asked by Ken Kuhn is, what were the immigration's policies and histories prior to World War I? Or is that a topic for your next paper?
Well, there were three major waves of immigration. One between 1885 and 1914. That happens to be when my respective grandparents came, and many others. That was a huge wave. I think the interwar one in the period I discussed today was probably a smaller immigration period, and it was followed by, again, a really large one between 1946 after the end of the war and about 1960. That was another huge waves. Each one had its own characteristics. I'm thinking of the population we're talking here about German Lutherans, and if you talk to German Lutherans, we would have to ride the time machine back, because of course those folks are now deceased. But if we had conversation between the first wave, the 1885 to 1914, then the interwar period, and then the 1946 to 60, there'd be certain similarities, of course, but real big differences as well. And we can see that in our Ukrainian, I'm speaking to you from Edmonton, where we have a lot of Ukrainian settlers, and if you meet Ukrainian folks, I have found the same thing. The stories are very different depending on where they came from, what part of Ukraine, first of all, because when we were talking about Bukovina, Galicia, and Volhynia, at an earlier time, those were parts of Poland. Some of it was parts of Russia. Then there was the revolution that came along with collectivization and so on. So every immigrant from every period will have a different story. The period before 1914, Ken, was very active from around the turn of the century, because we had an interior minister named Clifford Sifton, who was a very active minister for immigration and colonization at that time. And so there was a big period of immigration. It was also the period then when when Germany proper was a preferred nation to receive immigrants from. That changed after the First World War. So those are some comments. Ken, as with any history, once you get into the weeds, it's you'll never get out of them.
Corinne was wondering whether in your research did you encounter material that referred to anti-Semitism? Did the research indicate how the LIB or Canadian Lutherans in general felt about Jewish Germans or German-speaking people immigrating to Canada? Thinking, for example, of the Missouri St. Louis carrying 930, or the MS St. Louis, or the ship carrying 937 Jewish refugees that was turned away by Canada in 1939.
There was nothing specific that I found in the literature. Under the Railways Act of 1925, though, where the CPR was given a monopoly of choosing immigrants, there were indications in the literature that I had access to that the CPR bent a lot of the rules in their own favor. For example, only agricultural workers were to be admitted, and the CPR, having the monopoly, turned a blind eye, and a lot of the folks selected for immigration ended up on the CPR payroll. So that was, one place where the rules were bent. We did have this distinction between preferred immigrants and non-preferred immigrants, and the St. Louis vessel that is referred to in the question, of course, was just blatant anti-Semitism. I don't know to what extent Lutherans were involved in that. The really sad quote I remember of that vessel was when one of the government ministers was saying that 0 Jews was too many. None was too many, I think, was the phrase that was used. So I can't answer the question more fully than that. It was did not appear as a theme in any of the literature I read.
It may be a very interesting point of research for the future. Which reminds me that in a future webinar, we're calling for papers, and that might be one worth considering as well. Okay, thank you. Jennifer also raised a question. Did the research reveal what kinds of settlement supports the LIB aided with, especially for families such as English language instruction, orientation to Canadian culture, agricultural skills training, etc.? Was there any of that in the material you were able to look at?
All the LIB officials, from the board and down to the parish pastors, were all German Lutheran pastors. And so I don't believe that was a priority to integrate folks. I think it was felt that was going to happen in an organic kind of way. If anything, I think there was an emphasis on the part of LIB and German Lutheran speaking clergy that we were going to maintain the language and culture and also the forms of worship. And if any of you have got a library like Gordon's, I know my father did, all the hymn books, the Bibles that were used in worship in Western Canada were all printed and imported from Germany, initially anyway. And then later they were printed in Germany in American publishing houses, but it was all in the German language. So no, I do not think that was a high priority. Interesting thing that was in one of the source authors that I wrote, he also talked about, and this was still a time when the German Lutheran clergy, a majority, perhaps a majority, or if not a majority, and a significant minority of them had been, they were immigrants from Germany themselves. born, raised, trained, and ordained in Germany, and then came to Canada. So they too were immigrants. And there was sort of a class distinction between the German-born, educated Lutheran clergy and the North American-born, trained Lutheran clergy. And the second group was seen as not quite up to the standards of the first group. That, would have, being with the name of Busch and having some familiarity with the German personality, I can see how that would have caused some tensions at some time. But to answer the basic question, no, I don't think integration into English-speaking Canada was a priority.
Thank you. I think Robert Granke made a comment about one of the permanent results of the LIB and then later CLWR, of course, is that it provided an arena for Lutherans to actually work together. And one can wonder, my comments afterwards, I wonder how this has helped facilitate inter-Lutheran discussions and even, as we talked about in the first two webinars, the movement towards a possible merger of the three Lutheran church bodies in Canada. Anyone, do you want to comment on that at all? Your thoughts?
Yeah, it was interesting. Hopefully it came across that, and if you read the paper, there's an accompanying paper that was much larger than what I was able to present in the time I had today. So, for example, in that paper, I listed the founding members of the Western branch, the founding members of the Eastern branch, and I've listed the synods that they are from. And an interesting surprise for me was reading about TOF Herzer, but there were others. There was August Bepler of Concordia College in Edmonton, which was a Missouri Synod organization. There was Arthur Eisfeld from Winnipeg, who was a Missouri. The Missouri Synod clergy were very active. It's fair to say that TOF Herzer really stands out amongst all of them for his role with not only LIB, but the other church-sponsored immigration agencies, as well as secular ones. He was a real Renaissance man and ran on ever-ready batteries. What he accomplished in his life was just amazing. His biography is quite something. So Missouri Synod was very active in the LIB. You mentioned the unionism issue, and I've addressed that in my paper as well, Gordon. That was an issue, and that's an issue that I think maybe those themes still are present out there, but certainly Missouri Synod were real shakers and movers in the LIB, and that was somewhat of a surprise to me, coming from an Ohio Synod, an American Lutheran Church background as I did. I wasn't aware of that very strong Missouri Synod leadership role.
It's kind of interesting. On the one hand, they have that leadership role. On the other hand, the unionism concerns.
Actually, I would have. Somebody should write a stage play about TOF Herzer dropping into a synod convention where they're having that debate, because he seemed to be really beyond that point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. One person has asked whether there's a record of lay persons or women being part of the organization or involved with supportive roles, because we noticed it was almost a white male German clergy. What's not in the historical records that perhaps could have been there or should have been mentioned?
They made the sandwiches and the coffee.
And that was
it. It's
it.
Not in the written record. That's my editorial comment. There was no mention of any women in a leadership role. None. That really stood out, and that's why I made the comment I did, that it was a social organism of its time, male-led and clergy-led. So no, I did not see any evidence of female roles other than what I imagine would have been, very traditional roles of supporting supporting the church through traditional roles.
Well, I think in the absence of mentioning of lay leadership involvement and also the absence of any mention of women involvement, that's been a all too common story in a lot of part of Lutheran history and church history, to be honest, for much of our generations. And we need to keep rewriting those histories and rediscovering them. It reminded me of the one time I was teaching a course on medieval church history, and I was mentioning Julian of Norwich. And to my surprise, one of the students in my class had come from Norwich. She had only come about 15 years earlier. And when she found out where the Julian had her refuge, was only a few blocks from her house, but she had never heard of her at that time. And it was, she said, strange to come to Canada and then read about the history of Julian of Norwich when she was living right next door to where she was. So in her anchorage. The other thing I think that can be further explored that we need to continue to talk about is not just the German refugees coming at the time, but also, for example, Scandinavian, which has formed a large part of the Canadian Lutheran history scene. Although to a large degree, many of the Scandinavians came in directly to Canada, went through the States first, especially in Western Canada, but that would be worth more research. I know my relatives on my dad's side came from Denmark in 1929, not the ideal time to come, but they landed in Halifax at that point. So there was some that was direct as well.
I also think, Gordon, and I'd bow to your expertise on this, that there was a German attitude about maintaining the German language in worship, and not just in worship, but also in education and German culture, which theme I have not experienced with Scandinavian Lutheran folks that I've known over the years. So either a different mentality, perhaps, or a different very strategic direction. We are not going to go forward with our traditional language and culture, more of an assimilationist idea, perhaps.
I do remember reading reports from a convention of the Norwegians in North Dakota in the 1930s. And one of the delegates did stand up and speak and say that while he realized that God understood English, he was quite convinced that God didn't like it as well as Norwegian. And so they argued that worship should stay in the Norwegian language there. And I think, so those kinds of feelings have carried through in many of the different immigrant groups as well. One of the people has proposed or asked if you're interested in doing a paper on the other legacies of the Lutheran Immigration Board, including the ongoing work of welcoming displaced persons by people like Reverend Ernst Hahn, because Hahn was involved in refugee sponsorship and partner with CLWR prior to his passing in 2021. So is there any interest in going to that direction?
I hope there is. When I was invited to do this project, the original request was to do something around CLWR. And as I said, I found some excellent resource material. Karen Achtelstetter will maybe speak about this, about how, or when I was on the board of CLWR, I asked about the archives, and I was told how many dozens of boxes there were, but that really not a lot of work had been done. This is what's so exciting about what's happened now in Kitchener-Waterloo with the archives of the churches, as well as CLWR being formally organized by professional archivists. This is a wonderful outcome. So doing for somebody or some folks who are going to be doing research in the future, they have wonderful cataloged resources at their disposal. Whether it'll be me or not, whoever does it, it'll be easier. Now, there was in my larger paper, there was a Pastor Han who was a director in the Eastern LIB. I'm not sure if it's probably, if this Han you're referring to has died in 2021, it would not be that person, but perhaps a successor. What I've discovered in this process, and you know, I thank the committee, I thank Karen, Don Sjoberg, you, and Steve Larson for taking us down the history road. Canadian Lutheran history is just amazing. I had a lot of fun putting this paper together, just doing the research. It's very interesting stuff.
One of the other comments in chat was just a question: why the term refugee was not used for such resettlement?
Yeah, when we think of the word refugee, I think it has had a shifting meaning over the decades. Mm-hmm. And in the literature that I had access to, the term, if they were leaving Europe, they were emigrants, E-M-I-G-R-A-N-T-S. If they were entering Canada, they were immigrants, I-M-M-I-G-R-A-N-T-S. And I think perhaps the term refugee has a very specific meaning to us nowadays. And in 1947, for example, the International Organization for Migration, which was one of the first agencies of the new United Nations, founded in 1945 after the war. I think more technical definitions were put together at that time that inform what we think of as a refugee now. A refugee nowadays has a very specific meaning. So in a broad general sense, perhaps we could have called some of the folks who had been, quotes, driven out of the eastern, some of the eastern countries in Eastern Europe might be considered refugees. Certainly other folks were seeking a better life. Mm-hmm. So I could have used the term, but because it was not common in the literature for that time, I didn't use it, but I'm sure it has applicability nevertheless.
Yeah. I think sometimes refugee is more associated, as you noted, with internal displacement in one's country before immigrating elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I want to thank you for this and for your comments and the reflections and questions, and the questions from others and your responses. I wanted to very briefly comment that we are looking again at call for papers for future webinars, and I think we would like to reflect on a lot of what topics you are interested in as well. And we're also looking at perhaps a seminar in person, a conference in person at some point down the road to get together as people interested in Canadian Lutheran history to discuss this. So that's something for the future to keep in mind. there was a hand raised. You noted, Christina.
I was raising my hands. On my question. This is Senate. Hi, Marcus. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Just following up on, I didn't quite understand when you said that. So the term refugee is used at that time for people who were fleeing Eastern Europe. Is that what you said? And my other question is the convention refugee declaration was after the 1946 people who Lutherans were coming after 1946, and I'm wondering still then, because I'm asking this question because I work with Lutheran constituency, and back 2014, I believe we had organized an event for people who came through Beaver Bree, and I have encountered people who identified themselves as refugees, and some said we're not refugees, we're immigrants, and I still have struggles to understand. I get your point prior to 1946. I just thought that I should bring this to you in case you have anything to say. Thank you.
Well, after the International Organization for Migration was formed, shortly after that, I think within the year, then UNHCR was formed, which continues to this day and is the international body that oversees international. Well, it's not so much, but I guess the two organizations sort of spell it out. One was called an Organization for Migration. The other one was called an Organization for Refugees. Migration, to me, seems to suggest people who voluntarily are moving from place to place to better their life. Perhaps there's the voluntary component, whereas I think refugees are people who are either internally displaced within their own country. They really have no choice. They've been forced into internal exile in their country or across an international border. So in a broad sense, to me, refugees have it a lot harder. They've had coercion be driving them, whereas I think migrants or immigrants of earlier periods, maybe people make the decision to better their life by moving. It's probably a continuum, and you probably have a number of other overlapping factors which I haven't even thought of.
Thank you.
That's sort of how I would answer it in a general way, anyway.
Thank you. And thank you so much for this. And it's my delight to turn this over to Bishop Sjoberg now.
Thank you. It's really quite wonderful to think of what has been shared, and also to know there's much more to research. And thank you for your skill, Marcus, and for that which has prompted you to do that. And no doubt part of your experience as president of Canadian Lutheran World Relief has increased that interest. And I think that's when you came to meet Karen, right? Who has been with Canadian Lutheran World Relief as the executive director for some 5.5 years now. And she has signed up for another term, which I think we would
thank you.
celebrate very much. So Karen, back to you to share and introduce your colleagues.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for including CLWR in your webinar series. And I just, first of all, really want to say, congratulations. We so much appreciate and admire the substantial and important work of your research and what you're doing. It's been great to listen to the presentation of Marcus. Of course, because he's our former CLWR president, and that's lovely. But it's also lovely to see so many familiar faces, at least online. But I also would like to introduce my colleagues to you who are online. First of all, my colleague Jennifer Arden. Jen is our refugee resettlement manager in our Kitchener-Waterloo office. Jennifer majored in Canadian immigration history. And then I also want to acknowledge Rachel Manune. She is CLWR's Refugee Resettlement Program Assistant in our BC office. And then I also discovered, and we heard her speak, my dear colleague Sanad, who is also online, although she's actually on vacation. And she is our director of CLWR's Refugee Resettlement Program. So I had not expected her to be there, but you see how important your research is. That we are all joining in to learn more about our own history. The title of your project, Remember Today for the Church of Tomorrow, indicates how important it is to understand our history, and it acknowledges how our history, consciously or unconsciously, has shaped us, and what we need to take into account as we imagine our future. And let me just mention a few emerging topics and burning issues that we in CLWR are addressing at the moment, and which also impact our work with regard to refugee resettlement and our international work. On the occasion of its 75th anniversary, CLWR embarked on a comprehensive anti-racism audit, which included not just our organization, but also our relations with stakeholders, partners, and communities. We are still not through with this audit. Not only CLWR, but our whole sector is challenged to decolonize humanitarian aid and to reflect about our efforts in the ongoing reconciliation process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples, and to recognize racism, discrimination, and bias in humanitarian systems and actions. It is fascinating to see how LRB's organizational history has also shaped CLWR's work. And I just want to briefly quote from Marcus' presentation. LRB directors determined which rural Lutheran parishes would be willing and be able to receive and care for immigrants, and in what numbers. This is very similar to the way CLWR collaborates and engages with Lutheran congregations today, ensuring that they have the human and financial resources to welcome refugees. And then one last remark. I'm really excited that our archive material is now accessible in Waterloo. And I hope for many, many academic reports, papers, and research students and academics who are interested in CLWR's history. And I think we will learn a lot. So thank you for that. And now I would like to briefly give the platform to CLWR's immigration historian, Jennifer, so that she can share her reflections based on her day-to-day experience in our refugee resettlement program.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much, Marcus, for your extensive research and paper on the Lutheran Immigration Board. As someone who works with Canadian Lutheran World Relief and as a student of Canadian immigration history, very grateful for the contributions of your work. I'm particularly fascinated with the similarities of the Lutheran Immigration Board's work and Canadian Lutheran World Relief's refugee resettlement work. You can see that there is a strong connection with the work of Lutherans almost 100 years ago to the work that Lutherans are doing now, such as helping displaced persons to resettle and have new lives in Canada, working with congregations who are willing and able to receive and care for newcomers, providing support for 1 year and working in partnership with the Canadian government to oversee the integrity of the refugee resettlement program. CLWR is a sponsorship agreement holder with the Canadian government, along with many other religious, ethnocultural organizations. And I believe that it is part of that history of religious organizations like the Lutherans, Mennonites, Catholics, who were working to settle displaced persons, that has brought on the program of the sponsorship agreement holders, of which CLWR is a part of. You can clearly see the connections between the work of the Lutheran Immigration Board, how that connects to the work that CLWR is doing and will continue to do in the future.
That is a blessing shared in different ways, and blessed to be a blessing really carries forth in what CLWR is all about and what you invite us to be doing as partners in this great endeavor. And so, to use a version of an Irish blessing, I say, may joy and peace surround you, contentment latch your door, and happiness be with you. God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit bless you evermore. Amen. Go in peace. Thanks be to God.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again, Marcus. Great paper.